We move now to the Society of United Professionals, and I believe Laurie Reid is going to be the representative.
Yes.
Go ahead, please. State your name and your organization.
My name is Laurie Reid. I am the Secretary-Treasurer of the Society of United Professionals, a role that I was elected into after having been a policy advisor at the Ontario Energy Board for, well, let's just say over 20 years and leave it at that. So if you have any questions about how the OEB works and the processes, you can ask me during question period. Thanks very much to the committee and the chair for listening to my presentation today. The Society represents over 10,000 employees, largely professionals in the energy sector. We are the union that represents all staff at the Ontario Energy Board, as well as professional staff at several companies regulated by the OEB, both publicly and investor-owned. The Society believes that Bill 165 would override the OEB's regulatory independence. It would undermine trust in the province's regulatory framework. We also believe that the bill is totally unnecessary. If the government has legitimate concerns, it already has the tools to address them. Our written submission speaks to how the proposed legislation is ineffective in 3 of its stated goals. It will not protect future home buyers and promote affordable housing because it's likely to burden future ratepayers with the costs of stranded assets due to fuel switching. It will not maintain customer choice with respect to energy options because it distorts the cost decision. It hides upfront costs by pushing them into operating costs, driving people into decisions that will cost them more in the long run. It does not ensure that the government sets policy because the government already does that, and the OEB regulates within those policies. These discussions are in our written submission. So let me spend my time today looking at the regulatory framework. Yes, the government sets policy. Its agencies, including the Ontario Energy Board, implement it. They interpret the legislation and policy announcements and put them into action. In making this decision, the commissioners at the OEB looked at the government's Powering Ontario's Growth report that expects Ontario homes will increasingly rely on electric heat pumps for home heating, at the Clean Home Heating Initiative that supports shifting to electric heat pumps, and at federal incentives under the Greener Homes program for fuel switching. The commissioners made a decision that supports these policies. And in fact, the main role of the energy regulator is not to implement government policy. It is to regulate natural monopolies, like energy utilities, to try and mimic the effects of competition. They do this according to a set of well-developed regulatory principles. One of those principles is that the customer who benefits should pay the cost. An increase in the cost of a new home is added to the homeowner's mortgage and paid by them over many years. An increase in the utility infrastructure is factored into ongoing rates and paid by every customer of the utility for 40 years. If that homeowner takes advantage of one of these programs in a few years and those assets become stranded, the remaining customers of the utility are picking up the tab. Of course, regulatory decisions are not infallible. If any person or company involved believes that the OEB erred in fact or law, they can appeal the decision. They have done that in the past. It is an accepted part of the regulatory process. The government overriding the OEB's regulatory independence through Bill 165 is far worse. Government interference in regulatory decisions sends a chill through the investment community, disrupts utility business planning, and most importantly to the Society of United Professionals and me, it demoralizes the staff of the OEB. As people have said already today, these are complex cases that take pages of evidence, months of analysis and interrogatories, days of technical and settlement conferences, and hours of hearing time with expert testimony, cross-examination, and undertakings. For the government to negate all of that because they simply don't like the outcome is an extreme action. The Society believes that Bill 165, if passed as written, would override the OEB's regulatory independence and severely undermine trust in the province's regulatory framework. It is difficult to imagine any amendments that would make this level of political interference with our energy regulator acceptable. As such, the Society stands in strong opposition to Bill 165 and urges this committee to recommend to the Legislature that the bill be withdrawn. Thank you.
Again, through you, Chair, and to the Society, your position is very different. Can you tell us why you believe that what's before us will be a complete override of an independent regulator?
The Ontario Energy Board has to be seen by the investment community, by the people they regulate, and by ratepayers as being independent and able to come to their own decisions based on the evidence before them. It's, in our submission, we talk about Standards & Poor's saying that the independence and transparency and evidentiary base of regulation is so important in the decisions that they make in evaluating investor-owned utilities, which there are several in Ontario, in terms of their ratings, the ability of those companies to raise capital. So if you start to overturn on the decisions of the Ontario Energy Board based on some short-term thinking, then and as you have said, lobbying of the minister, then all of that is put in jeopardy.
And you mentioned investor chill, which I was more concerned about the everyday application of strange decisions to our daily lives. Why do you say that the elimination or the bypass of an independent regulator would chill the atmosphere for investors?
This goes to the importance of the independence of the regulator. Time and time again, the companies that we regulate have told us, from their perspective, it doesn't really matter what the OEB's decision is. They just have to be able to depend on it and to do their business planning around it. The changes that have been indicated, they will.
1 minute.
Investor-owned utilities will take those in stride and plan around them for their businesses. It's the changing back and forth and the uncertainty around the ability of the government to impose decisions on the OEB rather than let them be independent that makes the companies themselves and the investors in them and the rating agencies nervous.
So, and you mentioned the rating agencies. You're talking about credit rating agents, Standard & Poor's,
yes,
etc. And so their opinion of Ontario decision-making would be reduced?
Yes.
Interesting. And you base that on what assessment?
The policy paper that Standards & Poor's has put out talking about, you'll see that referenced in our submission, talking about how important regulatory independence is.
And why does it lead to a downgrade in an assessment? Does it seem that we would have capricious decision-making? Or just
Thank you very much. Your time is up. MPP
you,
Tabbins, next round. Independent member, MPP Schreiner.
Thank you, Chair. Through you to the presenters, thank you for being here today. Being an independent member doesn't make me an independent regulator, just to be very clear, which is why I am deeply concerned about undermining the independence of the independent regulator. And so my first question really is going to go to the Society of United Professionals. I mean, you've started outlining, I think, very valid concerns, but I want to give you a moment before I ask a few additional questions just to talk about the rating agencies and how that affects both investment in Ontario from the utilities themselves, but also the implications for the province as a whole in terms of the government's rating towards investment in Ontario. Yeah.
So the utilities that the OEB regulates are quite large companies, and Enbridge itself is an international company. There's Enbridge Gas Distribution, which is primarily in Ontario, but Enbridge Pipelines and the parent company are international companies. So, as I say, they depend on regulatory independence and an evidentiary-based process to come to the rules under which they operate. And they structure their business around those rules and carry out their business through those. If the decisions are being overturned and I'll use the term flip-flopping back and forth based on political pressure, then it's an unstable business environment for them. Unstable business environments make the rating agencies very nervous. They don't like to see that. Utilities are usually extremely stable. They are given a regulated rate of return, and they get to make that, and it carries on, and they're considered very good companies. We have in Ontario not just Enbridge, but on the electricity side, Hydro One is now a publicly traded company. Only active really in Ontario, but also subject to ratings by the agencies and active on the stock market. That will then, the ability of the OEB to independently come to regulate the Hydro One will then in fact affect its rating as well, and its ability to attract capital, and then its rating affects its ability to attract capital to do capital projects.
Right. And I would assume its rating also affects the cost of that capital as well, which would have serious implications for people of Ontario, because it could lead to higher borrowing costs to build the infrastructure we need to power our homes and our economy. Am I right about that?
Right, and the government policy on powering Ontario has considerable transmission as well as generation investments in it for the switching, the transition.
So if I'm not mistaken, then the political interference, the potential, particularly through changes to Section 96.2, could lead to lobbyist-driven policymaking, which then could lead to downgrading of rating of our utilities, which would increase their capital costs, which would then make it more expensive to build infrastructure in Ontario, right? Increasing costs for businesses and homeowners. Am I correct with that?
I would say so, yes.
Yeah, okay. That's what I thought. And then I'm just wondering, in the few minutes we have left, could you just talk about the cost implications of stranded assets on businesses and homeowners?
So a utility makes money on its rate base. That's the infrastructure, the assets that it has paid for in order to serve the customers. Any time that an asset becomes stranded, means it's no longer, and the regulatory term is used and useful. Yep. So it sits off to the side, and there's no customer for it anymore, so it doesn't acquire any revenue.
Time is up. Thank you very much.
But it sits on the asset books.
We move to the government side. MPP Sarrazin.
Well, thank you, Chair, and thank you to all of you for the presentation. Really interesting when you were talking about the heating system, and I think we don't do as much as we could when it comes to heat recovery. And I was thinking of, I used to work at a steel plant in my riding, and there's a lot of energy there that could be recuperated. But I guess if we're not doing it, it's probably because it's costing a lot of money to build the infrastructure to do it. But maybe I'll ask you to comment on this later. I don't know, but my first question is, when it comes to the OEB, and is Laurie?
Yes.
There was a member of the OEB, and a few questions that comes to mind is like, how do you select the organization that will be there at the table? Because what we've heard from this consultation wasn't every sector at the table, and they could have like the construction companies, and another thing, do you feel like if it wouldn't be for OEB, we'd pay more in electricity and more in gas in Ontario? And maybe you can touch on these two questions.
Okay. So this wasn't a consultation, as the OEB calls consultations. This was a hearing. This was a procedure. So at the beginning of a procedure, the OEB sends out notice to the community at large and says, we're going to hold this hearing. Anyone, any party, any person that is interested in it, please self-identify and we'll put you on for communications about this hearing. So for people like the gentleman in the previous panel, their organizations act as interveners. They're not parties to the proceeding, but they are interveners, so they get all the communications and they have the opportunity to make submissions, participate in technical conferences, all of that. And not only that, but the party who has made the application pays their costs. So the OFL has often been one of the interveners in Ontario Energy Board hearings, and had their costs paid by the applicant. So I'm a little confused about why they didn't take the opportunity to participate in this hearing when they probably got notice of it, when they would get their costs paid. But I will actually say the OEB does a lot of work. It holds a lot of hearing, and very often interveners decide based on the issues list which ones they want to be involved in and which ones they don't think are worth their time. So it may be that over time this procedure developed to the point, and certainly by the time it came to the decision, where it was of interest to them, and by that point they were not participating.
And I can understand, it's really hard to communicate with all these organizations. I mean, we as a government, often encounter that. One other question I got about we're talking about, I was on a board of director of a local LDC and in 2014, and it was the smallest in Ontario. And I remember when we did our, whatever you call it, cost of service rebasing, often we had some organization that intervened, and at times it cost us like $15,000 for this company. And that's money we had to put back on the price of electricity, and we were talking about 1,000 customers. So I'm wondering, at the end of the day, we're looking at OEB to try to help us in, getting the best price on electricity in Ontario. But are we looking at doing something with this? Because, I guess there's a number of interveners. There could be 20 of them, and it could end up costing these hydro utilities a lot of money.
Yes. There's constantly talk about how many interveners we have and what different interests they represent. So the Ontario Energy Board encourages interveners who have the same interests to work together and therefore share costs. For example, it's Ontario Flowers.
Flowers Canada.
Flowers Canada, sorry. And the OFL, the Ontario Energy Board would encourage to work together. Vulnerable energy consumers and low-income energy network, excuse me, and Consumers Canada, they encourage them to work together, representing small consumers and people who may experience energy poverty. They encourage them to work together. We also, and the government and the Ontario Energy Board encouraged many of these small LDCs to band together and represent more customers and spread those costs over more customers, so each individual customer didn't see as much impact.
And maybe one more question to you, Chair, and I'm taking the opportunity to learn more about, these processes. And at the end of the day, these interveners, do they make a difference? Or sometime, if you look at the whole, the amount of cost of service being done by different utilities, do you see that they do come there and they change the actual price of the electricity? Or?
They do. I was involved early in my career at the OEB looking at that in itself. And one of the interveners came with the facts and figures at that time, 20 years ago, to show that the costs of having those interveners there was a fraction of the amount of money taken out of the cost of service application by the applicant, so that they more than pay for themselves for the ratepayers.
I think the witness said OFL, and I think you meant to say the Ontario Federation of Agriculture.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. In my current life, I'm more involved with the OFL, but
Could we make sure that
Yeah,
that's
sure.
the point of clarification?
We will correct.
Thank you.
thank you.
Again, through you, Chair, going back to the society, I hope everyone reads your written submission. It's very interesting. It's not that long, it's true. The argument has been made against the Ontario Energy Board, saying that the government should be setting energy policy, not the regulator. But you note that in the specific case of the Ontario Energy Board and this Enbridge decision, that the OEB actually was following government policy, that the OEB referred to the government's Powering Ontario's Growth Report, something the minister referred to at the beginning of the day, and highlighted the expectation that Ontario's homes will rely more on electric heat pumps to heat their homes as part of the province's energy transition. There's no question the government's saying we need to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on electricity because we're going to have a lot more heat pumps. It wasn't the opposition that was saying this. Wasn't the third party or the independents, as good looking as they may be, but in fact the government itself. And the OEB was sorry guys, just take a second position when it comes to that. So that in fact, government's saying there's going to be more electric heating and less gas heating in the future. That is the government's plan. And so the OEB looked at this, looked at the larger trends in electrification and said, yeah, there are going to be stranded assets. People who are on the gas system are going to get stuck with a bill in the future if we don't act now. And that's what they did here. Am I interpreting what you've written correctly?
Yes.
Okay, interesting. The second thing that was really striking to me is the Standard & Poor's Global, the bond rating agency. You refer to this. You had a chance to talk about it earlier. In a recent analysis, they talked about the 4 pillars of Ontario's natural gas and electricity regulatory environment. They're regulatory stability, tariff setting procedures, financial stability, regulatory independence. And they said that this is a good setup for people who are going to invest, and as a credit rating agency we could look at the investment and make a decision knowing the environment you'll be operating in, with this caveat. If there was a loss of regulatory independence or instances of political interference in the framework, that would be a substantial problem. So my assumption is that Standard & Poor's would give a rating for an energy investment in Ontario a lower rating than it would have in the past, making the cost of capital more expensive. Is that a correct understanding?
That's my understanding of how it works as well.
So in fact, the bill before us is going to make it more difficult for people to invest in Ontario. That's correct?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I had suspicions, but it's useful to have it set out here.
I want to come back here to the Society of United Professionals. So we left off talking about stranded assets, and who, I guess from the regulator's viewpoint, which consumers are most at risk due to stranded assets in the gas network?
Well, I can give you a concrete example.
Sure, go for it.
I used to live in the beaches in Toronto, and our house was surrounded by 12 enormous oak trees, and I had no opportunity for solar panels. I moved out to a 1970s subdivision in St. Catharines, and part of the money I made from my house in Toronto went into solar panels on the roof. Because of that, and I sized the system quite aggressively, I was a natural gas rental water heater customer, and I was a natural gas furnace customer. I went all electric. So Enbridge came and they took the meter away But all of the piping that comes into my house, everything else in that is now stranded. I am no longer an Enbridge customer. So they are not getting any money from me from the infrastructure that comes to my house.
Gotcha.
And that's what a stranded asset
Right.
is.
Thank you for that. And it's government policy, if I'm not mistaken, even though I would argue the current government's not being aggressive enough, given the climate obligations and just the disasters we're already experiencing. But it is government policy that we will electrify heating and maybe have some district energy to go with it. Like that's current government policy from the existing provincial government. Am I right about that?
They're saying that that's certainly the expectation.
Yeah, so almost by definition, we will have stranded assets
Yes.
if we continue to invest in assets that are going to be no longer needed.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And then my guess is the industries that are the hardest to decarbonize are going to be holding the bulk of those stranded assets. And I think most of those are going to be manufacturing and agriculture because they're going to be the hardest areas to decarbonize. Am I correct in that assumption?
Yes, the stranded assets remain in the rate base, and the company continues to make a return on them, and that is recovered from fewer and fewer customers. So the rates for those customers go up.
Right. And if I'm not mistaken, the way sort of capitalism is supposed to work is investors take a risk. They think they're going to get a return on investment. But in this case, Enbridge, they're going to still get their return on investment, and the risk is being held by the people of Ontario.
1 minute.
By the ratepayers of Enbridge, yes.